Palmerston's Follies. 12 million pounds, 167 fortifications, and not a single shot fired in anger. The Palmerston Forts represent Britain's most ambitious peacetime fortification program, commissioned in panic over a French invasion that never came. Yet these Victorian engineering marvels serve purposes far beyond their original design, playing crucial roles in both world wars and surviving today as museums, luxury hotels, and heritage landmarks. The story of these so-called follies is one of political calculation, engineering innovation, rapid technological obsolescence, and remarkable adaptive reuse across 165 years of British history. The forts emerged from the 1859 Royal Commission on the Defense of the United Kingdom, established after France launched the world's first ocean-going ironclad warship, La Gloire, rendering Britain's entire wooden fleet obsolete overnight. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston championed a massive ring of fortifications around Britain's vital royal dockyards, primarily Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham, arguing that steam had bridged the channel and made invasion timing predictable for the first time. By completion in the 1880s, these granite and iron fortresses were already nicknamed Palmerston's Follies because the French threat had evaporated and artillery technology had advanced beyond their design parameters. Yet the irony is more complex than the nickname suggests. The forts served continuous military functions until 1956, proved invaluable in both world wars, and remain among the best preserved examples of Victorian military engineering in the world. As we journey through the ring of forts surrounding Portsmouth, climb the ramparts of Plymouth's mighty defenses, and descend into the underground headquarters that helped coordinate the liberation of Europe, we shall discover why these walls built against one threat proved invaluable against another, and why military architecture that technology supposedly passed by refused to become obsolete. The crisis that would reshape Britain's coastal defenses began with an assassination attempt. On the 14th of January, 1858, Italian revolutionary Felice Orsini threw Birmingham-manufactured bombs at Napoleon III's carriage outside the Paris Opera. 8 bystanders perished and 142 sustained injuries. When the bomb's English origins became known, French military officers openly called for invasion of Britain. The incident frayed Anglo-French relations at a stroke, reviving memories of the first Napoleon's ambitions that had haunted British strategic thinking for half a century. Napoleon III's subsequent military adventures only deepened British anxiety. His intervention in Italy during 1859, culminating in the battles of Magenta and Solferino, demonstrated French military capability. His annexation of Nice and Savoy in 1860 showed territorial ambition that seemed to know no bounds. France expanded her army to 500,000 men and announced plans to increase her fleet to 150 steamships. For an island nation that had relied upon wooden walls and the unpredictable English weather to deter invasion, these developments were alarming enough. What happened next changed everything. On the 24th of November, 1859, France launched La Gloire at Toulon. This 5,630-ton vessel was the world's first ocean-going ironclad warship. Her hull was protected by 12 centimeters of iron armor backing 43 centimeters of oak timber. Her 36 rifled guns could propel shells that no wooden warship could withstand, while experimental firing demonstrated that her armor could resist both French 50-pounders and British 68-pounders at 20 meters. She could make 13.5 knots under steam, allowing her to choose the time and place of engagement, regardless of wind conditions. In a single afternoon, La Gloire rendered Britain's entire wooden fleet obsolete. Queen Victoria personally asked the Admiralty whether the Navy remained adequate for its tasks. Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, was 75 years old when he became Prime Minister in June 1859. He had long harbored suspicions of French intentions, and now he formulated the strategic argument that would drive the greatest peacetime fortification program in British history. Steam propulsion, Palmerston argued, fundamentally changed the calculus of invasion. Sailing ships dependent upon favorable winds could be intercepted, and their arrival times were unpredictable, whilst their approach routes remained constrained by weather patterns. Steam vessels, by contrast, could strike at times and places of their choosing, concentrating forces against weak points in Britain's defenses before the Royal Navy could respond. Palmerston's conviction that Britain's coastal defenses were inadequate to prevent invasion if the Royal Navy was lured elsewhere drove his decision to establish a Royal Commission. The 1859 Royal Commission on the Defense of the United Kingdom sat from the 3rd of November, 1859, chaired by Major General Sir Henry David Jones, with 6 other commissioners. These included Rear Admiral George Augustus Elliot, Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Lefroy of the Royal Artillery, and civilian architect James Ferguson, author of a pamphlet titled The Peril of Portsmouth that had captured public imagination. The Commission's secretary, Major William Francis Drummond Jervois of the Royal Engineers, would later design many of the forts himself. The Commission interviewed expert witnesses whose testimony shaped the program's direction. Captain Cowper Phipps Coles, hero of the Siege of Taganrog, became so enraged by questioning that he was twice asked to leave the chamber. General John Fox Burgoyne, Inspector General of Fortifications, argued for land defenses to protect naval bases. Sir William Armstrong, the great armaments manufacturer, testified that artillery range would be unlikely to exceed 5 miles in the future, a prediction that technological progress would prove spectacularly wrong within a decade. The Commission's report, published on the 7th of February, 1860, concluded that the fleet, standing army, and volunteer forces, even combined, did not provide sufficient defense against invasion. Rather than attempting to fortify 700 miles of vulnerable coastline from the Humber to Penzance, the Commission recommended concentrating defenses on those points whose possession would give an enemy sure bases for operations. These were the Royal Dockyards at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham, the vital naval infrastructure without which Britain could not project power or protect her merchant fleet. The original cost estimate reached £11,850,000, including $3,020,000 for Plymouth, $2,800,000 for Portsmouth, and provision for 3,721 additional guns, with accommodation for 30,580 additional men. The Royal Engineers, under Colonel William Francis Drummond Jervois, designed and supervised the entire program, with civilian contractors performing the actual construction. Captain William Crossman designed the Portsdown Hill Forts, the Verne Citadel on Portland, and co-designed Tregantle Fort in Cornwall. Captain Edmund Frederick Duquesne designed Crown Hill Fort and Staden Fort at Plymouth. Captain E. H. Stewart designed the 4 Solent Sea Forts, with Sir John Hawkshaw, builder of the Severn Tunnel, advising on their revolutionary foundations. The land forts employed polygonal design, abandoning the older star-shaped bastions that had dominated European fortification since the Renaissance. These 6-sided layouts offered straight fronts with interlocking fields of fire, reducing the vulnerable salients that enemy artillery could target. Deep, dry ditches surrounded each fort, typically 40 to 60 feet deep and 30 to 70 feet wide, their walls lined with brick and flint revetments rising up to 30 feet. Into these ditches projected caponnières, covered galleries with rifle ports allowing defenders to sweep any attackers who reached the ditch floor with enfilading fire. Let us walk through Fort Nelson, the best preserved of the Portsdown Hill forts, to understand how these defenses function. We enter through a fortified gateway and cross a drawbridge spanning the deep ditch. The ramparts rise above us, their earth-covered slopes designed to absorb artillery impacts that would shatter exposed masonry. Casemated positions, vaulted chambers built into the ramparts, house the main armament behind iron shields mounted on metal traversing rails. Underground magazines positioned 40 feet below the parade ground store the unstable black powder safely away from enemy fire and accidental detonation. Ventilation shafts drew fresh air through the complex while communication tunnels connected defensive positions. The 4 Solent Sea Forts represented the program's greatest engineering challenge. Horse Sand, No Man's Land, Spitbank, and St. Helens were built on sandbanks covered by only 6 to 12 feet of water at low tide in one of the busiest shipping channels in the world. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before. The solution required revolutionary construction techniques that pushed Victorian engineering to its limits. Contractor John Tallerton Leather established what workers called Leathertown at Stokes Bay, a vast construction yard with cement mills, blacksmith shops, overhead railways carrying steam cranes, and a shanty town housing the workforce. The foundation method employed wrought iron cylinders 6 feet in diameter, lowered onto the seabed with divers working inside. These men dug out the center of each cylinder, allowing it to sink into the sandbank until it reached 55 feet below the seafloor, the maximum depth possible given that air pressure at 3 times atmospheric pressure was all the human body could tolerate. Screw piles with cast iron heads were driven into the seabed using capstans, supporting platforms that covered the entire foundation site. Circular railways for traveling steam cranes allowed materials to be positioned precisely. The foundation ring employed what engineers called the donut design, comprising concrete blocks with inner and outer stone facing. Horse sands walls reach 59 feet in total thickness, filled with clay and shingle, topped with 10 feet of concrete. The Fairbairn Engineering Company erected the entire 2,400-ton iron framework at their works to ensure perfect fit before shipping the components to site. Each dressed stone weighing between 3 and 8 tons was laid out on a cemented drawing board at Leathertown, numbered and marked with colored lines for divers to position underwater in pitch darkness. By 1864, 15,000 tons of concrete blocks and 7,000 tons of prepared stone stood ready on site. Foundation problems plagued construction throughout the program. Sturbridge Fort was abandoned in 1863 due to poor soil strata. Ryde Sand Fort was abandoned after construction started. Spit Sand required moving 600 yards to the southwest. St. Helens Fort tilted during construction due to unstable foundations, forcing designers to keep the superstructure central and giving it a distinctly different appearance from its sister forts. The primary weapons were rifled muzzle loading guns, representing the cutting edge of 1860s artillery technology. The 12.5-inch, 38-ton gun fired projectiles weighing between 800 and 820 pounds using 130 to 210 pounds of gunpowder, achieving muzzle velocities of 1,425 to 1,575 feet per second with ranges reaching 6,000 yards. Constructed with a mild steel A-tube surrounded by a wrought iron B-tube with triple coils, these weapons used Woolwich rifling with 9 broad, rounded grooves. They remained in service from 1873 until 1905. Horse Sand Fort's original armament plan called for 45 10-inch guns, 44 12.5-inch guns, and 10 12-inch weapons in 5 roof turrets that were never constructed. Shell types included Palliser armor-piercing rounds for attacking ironclads, common explosive shells, shrapnel for use against personnel, and case shot for close defense. Compound armor protection on the seaward sides of Horse Sand and No Man's Land forts reached 25 inches thick, comprising 5 alternating layers of 5-inch wrought iron and iron concrete, supplied by Camel and Company of Sheffield's Cyclops Iron and Steel Works. The forts were manned primarily by the Royal Garrison Artillery, specialists in siege and coastal artillery, supplemented by the Coast Brigade Royal Artillery, and volunteer units, including the 2nd Hampshire Volunteer Artillery. Without these part-time volunteer gunners, garrisoning all the Royal Commission forts would have been impossible. The regular garrison artillery simply lacked sufficient personnel to man every position. Living conditions were grim by any standard. The 1858 Royal Commission on the Sanitary Condition of the Army had revealed soldier mortality rates twice those of comparable civilians, 17 per thousand for soldiers aged 20 to 25 versus 8.4 per thousand for civilians of the same age. Over 57% of infantry casualties came from lung disease, attributed to vitiated atmosphere generated by overcrowding and deficient ventilation, combined with the absence of proper sewerage. Contemporary testimony describes soldiers sleeping in a foetid and unwholesome atmosphere with just 12 inches between beds. Daily rations comprised 1 pound of bread and 3/4 of a pound of uncooked meat, with a stoppage of 4.5 pence deducted from the 1 shilling daily pay. The menu was famously unchanging, captured in the soldier's sardonic rhyme describing boiled meat served new, boiled meat served old, boiled meat served hot, boiled meat served cold, boiled meat tender, boiled meat toho. Vegetables, butter, cheese, and tea cost extra from the soldier's meager remaining pay. Colonel Lindsay of the Guards described the daily routine that shaped garrison life. Soldiers rose at 6 in the morning, took breakfast at 7, and attended morning drill from 7:30 until 8. Men detailed for duty paraded at 10, with evening parade at half past the hour, and tattoo sounding at 9 in winter or 10 in summer. Lindsay observed that perhaps no living individual suffered more than the soldier from ennui, that the wearisome monotony of garrison life was injuriously irksome. One soldier's depression was documented in stark terms, recording that, since he had been at the fort, it had preyed more upon his mind, not having sufficient company nor enough work. Discipline remained harsh throughout this period, with flogging standard until reforms gradually reduced its use. In 1865 alone, 441 men received a total of 21,561 lashes. The forts became obsolete with remarkable speed. The same decade that saw their commissioning witnessed an artillery revolution that rendered their design parameters inadequate. Rifled muzzle loaders introduced in the 1860s could demolish casemates from 3 to 5 miles, outpacing the fort's own weapons, which were effective under 2 miles. By the 1870s and 80s, the guns mounted in these fortresses were outclassed by advances in naval armament. Italian Duilio-class ironclads mounted 17.7 2-inch guns, capable of piercing any fortification then existing. Britain's own response to La Gloire had been HMS Warrior, launched on the 29th of December, 1860. This iron-hulled ironclad was so superior to everything afloat that Admiral Jackie Fisher later declared she had made every other warship in the world obsolete. The 1876 HMS Thunderer accident, when a double-loaded 12-inch gun exploded with catastrophic casualties, accelerated the transition to breech-loading artillery. By the 1880s and 90s, breech-loading guns with faster rates of fire became standard, followed by quick-firing guns enabling much higher engagement rates against fast torpedo boats and destroyers. The political context shifted decisively with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. Napoleon III's overthrow and France's devastating defeat at Prussian hands eliminated France as Britain's primary strategic threat. The fort's original purpose evaporated before many were even completed. Recognition of obsolescence came progressively through official reviews. In 1888, a proposed 9-inch upgrade for Breandown Fort was never implemented. By 1891, some roof gun positions were being converted to lookout posts. In 1892, at Notha Fort, all 9-inch and 3 10-inch rifled muzzle loaders were declared obsolete. The 1905 Owen Committee declared heavy armament at Gilkicker, Stokes Bay, and Browndown to be superfluous. The nickname appeared within days of the program's parliamentary presentation. Press reports in July 1860 warned that unless the full program was funded, the coast would be dotted with unfinished stoneworks, christened Palmerston's Follies. Richard Cobden, the liberal politician who had just negotiated a free trade treaty with France, predicted in 1862 that he had no doubt those great excrescences would be held up in future generations and pointed at as Palmerston's Follies. The term carried multiple meanings. There was the architectural sense of folly as a costly ornamental building with no practical value. There was the accusation that the Portsmouth forts faced the wrong way, with guns aimed inland rather than out to sea. And there was simple hindsight judgment that they never served their intended purpose. Yet each of these criticisms deserves scrutiny. The forts were explicitly designed to prevent a hostile force from landing elsewhere along the coast, approaching Portsmouth from the mainland and capturing ports downhill. From those heights, enemy artillery could bombard the naval base in the harbor below. The Royal Commission had stated clearly that if Portsmouth was attacked from the north, none of the existing fortifications would protect the dockyard and harbor against bombardment from ports downhill. The inland-facing guns served their specific defensive purpose, while seaward defense was the role of coastal batteries and the Solent sea forts working together. None of the Palmerston forts fired in their intended defensive role during the 19th century. The closest they came to their original purpose occurred in 1940, when the Solent forts were brought to war readiness for the seizure of French warships anchored off Portsmouth after France's fall. As one assessment notes, this was the only time their armament was trained on the targets for which they had been originally built. The seizure was completed with little opposition, and actual firing from the guns on the forts was not necessary. Modern historians increasingly view the Follies designation as unfair. The changes that prompted the nickname occurred after the forts were commissioned, and warship development advanced both quickly and significantly during the construction period. As a deterrent, perhaps they worked, for the French never did invade. The Great War found unexpected uses for these Victorian fortresses. Fort Nelson became barracks for newly recruited soldiers before their deployment to the Western Front, its casemates and parade grounds echoing with the footsteps of men who would soon face a very different kind of warfare in the trenches of Flanders. Crown Hill Fort served as a recruitment and transport center for troops sent to Turkey and Africa during the Gallipoli campaign and subsequent operations. Later, it became a demobilization depot and base for the newly created Royal Signals Corps. Fort Southwick trained soldiers in the specialized art of capturing and holding fortified positions, lessons that would prove grimly relevant on the Western Front. After the armistice, it processed returning soldiers for demobilization. The sea forts received updated armament to counter new threats. St. Helens Fort became a searchlight battery with two 12-pounder quick-firing guns and searchlights installed in 1916. Spitbank Fort had its roof fitted with two 4.7-inch guns and searchlights for defense against light surface craft. Fort Gillkicker's walls were strengthened with earthwork embankments, and a 3-inch quick-firing gun on high-angle mounting was installed in 1916 to engage aircraft, a threat that the original Victorian designers could never have imagined. The Second World War brought the Palmerston Forts their most significant military contribution, one that far exceeded anything their original designers had envisioned. Fort Southwick's transformation began between February and December 1942, when 172 Tunneling Company of the Royal Engineers excavated a secret network of tunnels 100 feet beneath the Victorian fortification. This underground headquarters became the communications nerve center for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. 700 men and women of the Royal Navy, Army, Royal Air Force, and Allied nations worked in these subterranean chambers, processing the key information that gave General Eisenhower situational awareness of the Normandy beaches and the English Channel. Connected to nearby Southwick House, where Eisenhower established his headquarters, the underground complex used the call sign MIN. From these tunnels beneath a Victorian fort, the liberation of Europe was coordinated. The irony would not have been lost on Lord Palmerston. Fortifications built to defend against French invasion became the headquarters from which British and American forces launched the greatest seaborne invasion in history to liberate France itself. The Solent sea forts defended Portsmouth dockyards against threats their Victorian designers had never contemplated. A boom defense was rigged between no man's land and horse sand forts to protect against submarine attack, the primary naval threat of the Second World War. Personnel stationed on these isolated platforms were reportedly chosen deliberately for their inability to swim, discouraging any thoughts of escape from their lonely posting. The forts suffered damage from airstrikes, a threat against which their massive walls offered no defense. Fort Nelson was converted in 1938 to an area anti-aircraft ammunition store, with 10 large magazines built on the parade ground. Crown Hill Fort mounted anti-aircraft guns, the last time the fort was actively armed for combat. St. Helens Fort received a 40mm Bofors gun in 1943 for anti-shipping defense against German U-boats. The end of coastal artillery came in 1956 when the British Army abolished this branch of service across the country. All 4 Solent sea forts were left empty, their guns silent, their corridors abandoned to the seabirds and the salt wind. The following year, Fort Southwick's underground headquarters was sealed off, its wartime secrets locked away beneath the chalk downs. In 1963, the sea forts were offered for sale, but found no buyers for 2 decades. The Cold War brought Fort Southwick back to life when the underground headquarters reopened for NATO responsibilities, remaining operational until 2001. Many land forts found new uses even as their military significance faded. Fort Widley was sold to Portsmouth City Council in 1972. Crown Hill Fort was purchased by the Landmark Trust in 1987, beginning a process of restoration that would transform it into one of the finest preserved examples of Victorian fortification in Britain. Other forts became housing developments, industrial sites, or were simply abandoned to decay behind locked gates and warning signs. Fort Nelson stands today as the program's greatest heritage success. Hampshire County Council acquired the site in 1988, and it opened as a Royal Armories Museum in 1995. The fort now houses the National Collection of Artillery, comprising over 700 pieces spanning 600 years of firearms development. Visitors can examine a 15th-century Turkish bombard, a 200-ton railway howitzer, and parts of the Iraqi supergun that made international headlines in 1990. The 19-acre site offers free admission with live gun firings and demonstrations that bring the fort's military heritage to life. Crown Hill Fort, restored by the Landmark Trust since 1987, opens monthly with museum displays and cannon firings that recreate 1890s gun drill. Its collection includes a unique working Moncrief counterweight disappearing gun, one of only 2 surviving examples worldwide. This ingenious system allowed the gun to rise above the parapet to fire, then descend using counterweight and recoil energy for protected reloading. Visitors can also see 13-inch mortars believed to have been used during the Crimean War. The sea forts underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Spitbank Fort and No Man's Land Fort were converted to luxury hotels by Clarenso LLP around 2012 to 2015. Spitbank offered 9-bedroom suites, 3 bars, 3 restaurants, a rooftop champagne bar, wine cellar, hot pool, and sauna. No Man's Land provided 22 suites across 99,000 square feet with rooftop hot tubs and a laser battle arena. Both establishments closed during the COVID-19 pandemic and were sold at auction in 2024. Spitbank for just over £1 million and No Man's Land for approximately the same amount. Horse Sand Fort was sold in October 2021 for £715,000 with plans for conversion to a living time capsule museum. St. Helens Fort remains privately owned, operating a navigation lighthouse beacon that continues the maritime safety role its Victorian builders would have recognized. The forts enjoy extensive heritage protection, reflecting their historical and architectural significance. Grade 1 listed status covers Fort Southwick and Fort Nelson, recognizing them as buildings of exceptional interest. Grade 2 star-listed status protects Fort Woodley and Fort Pembroke. Scheduled ancient monument designations protect the sea forts and many land forts from inappropriate development or alteration. Historic England includes several forts on its Heritage at Risk register, including Fort Southwick at Grade 1 requiring repairs and Horse Sand Fort. The Palmerston Forts Society, founded in 1984 and based at Fort Nelson, works to preserve and document these Victorian engineering achievements for future generations. Recent conservation work includes £207,254 for Fort Pembroke's wrought iron bridges in 2021 and £264,292 for Fort Woodley's brick access bridges. From here, we can see the gray shapes of the sea forts on the horizon, still standing sentinel over waters they were built to defend 160 years ago. The guns are silent now, their crews long departed, but the walls remain as testimony to Victorian strategic anxiety, engineering ambition, and the British talent for adapting obsolete military infrastructure to new purposes across generations. The Palmerston Forts represent Victorian Britain's largest peacetime investment in static fortifications. Approximately 167 fortifications newly constructed or significantly upgraded at a cost exceeding £10 million, equivalent to well over £1 billion in today's currency. They employed cutting-edge polygonal fort design influenced by Crimean War experience, pioneered large-scale use of mass concrete in military construction, and demonstrated the rapid pace of 19th-century technological change that rendered them obsolete before completion. The Follies nickname, while memorable, obscures a far more complex legacy. These fortresses served continuous military functions for nearly a century. Fort Southwick's underground headquarters played a pivotal role in the liberation of Europe. The sea forts guarded Britain's most important naval base through 2 world wars. Today they survive as museums, heritage sites, and architectural landmarks, adapted but never truly abandoned, follies in name only. Russian General Count Todd Laban, the great military engineer who had defended Sebastopol against British and French forces during the Crimean War, inspected the Plymouth and Portsmouth forts in 1864. His verdict was unequivocal. They were ideally suited to their purpose. That their purpose evolved beyond Napoleon III's imagined invasion flotillas does not diminish the engineering achievement or the human stories embedded in these granite walls. From the soldiers who endured monotonous garrison duty to the engineers who built fortresses on sandbanks in the middle of a shipping channel, from the artillerymen who trained for a French attack that never came to the communications specialists who coordinated the Normandy landings from tunnels beneath Victorian ramparts, these walls witness the full sweep of modern British military history. The Palmerston Forts endure as monuments to an age when Britain still believed her security could be guaranteed by walls of granite and guns of iron. They remind us that the threats nations prepare for are not always the threats they ultimately face, but that well-built defenses can find new purposes across the generations. As the sun sets over the Solent and the lighthouse beacon on St. Helens Fort begins its nightly rotation, we are left with the image that lingers longest. These Victorian fortresses, built against one empire, defending against another, now stand as silent witnesses to the passage of time and the enduring human impulse to build walls against an uncertain future.